All right, so this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 16, the Era of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. We'll be looking at Section 1, Restoring the Union. So recall, Chapter 15 was all about the Civil War. That raged from 1861 to 1865, and it was a Northern or Union victory. And as a consequence of that war, you more or less had two outcomes that were important. One was that the Union, or the country, was preserved. Recall that the Civil War in some ways started when Southern states seceded or broke away from the Union. With the North being victorious, it meant that there would only be one United States rather than two. And the second major outcome was that slavery was abolished. This was mostly made concrete by Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued in 1862 during the war, which more or less stated that if the North were to win, then slavery would be abolished. And because the North won, that was the case. So those two things are true, right? We know those as definite outcomes of the war. However, this period, Reconstruction, 1865 through 1877, is the era after the Civil War. Right, so it's the era after the Civil War. And this, this term right here, Reconstruction, has kind of two meanings. One, it means to actually physically rebuild, right? Because this is the deadliest war in American history, so there's certainly some rebuilding that needs to take place, some reconstructing. But maybe more importantly, rebuilding the relationship. How do you take these two parts of the country, North and South, who despised one another, who hated one another, who killed each other for 4 bloody years, and make them countrymen again, right? Northerners and Southerners have to become all Americans again, and so Reconstruction kind of is the time where that process takes place. So it's in this particular period that all the other questions kind of related to these two topics here are going to be answered. So for example, when it comes to the Confederates or the rebels, one question during Reconstruction is, should they be punished? Right? Do you punish the South for what they did, or do you forgive for what they did? This will be figured out during the Reconstruction period. Slavery is abolished, but do blacks, now emancipated, have equal rights as whites? This question would have to be answered during Reconstruction. So it's about, these 10 or so years, however long it ends up being. It's about physically rebuilding the country, rebuilding the relationship between North and South, and then trying to decide all these other questions related to the war. So again, this term Reconstruction, we got a definition for it here. It's the time period after the Civil War where the country is physically rebuilding itself and rebuilding the relationship. So the first plan to do this comes from the president. The president at the time, of course, is Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln puts forward the 10% plan. This is Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. So Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. And his plan includes a couple of details. One is that, for the most part, everybody will essentially be forgiven except high-ranking Confederate leaders. So we could say Confederates will be forgiven with this exception. So unless you were a high-ranking leader, a high-ranking Confederate military officer, something along those lines, Lincoln is willing to kind of put you down this path, forgive and forget, welcome you back into the country. Lincoln also requires that 10% of the voting population, hence this term, right, 10% plan, 10% of the voting population needs to take an oath of allegiance. This is to ensure that those people, at least 10% of those who can vote, are loyal to the United States rather than being loyal, let's say, to the Confederacy. The third condition of Lincoln's plan is emancipation of slavery. All right. And so as long as a state does all these things, right, if a state excludes high-ranking Confederates from the Reconstruction process, that is bringing them back into the country, if 10% of the population takes this oath of allegiance, and if the state agrees to abolish slavery, the state can rejoin the Union, right? When we look at Lincoln's plan, we would say that it's generally lenient. What Lincoln wanted to do was to reconstruct states. And again, what that means is that during the Civil War, states left or seceded from the Union. Lincoln wants to bring those back. So to reconstruct them, bring them back, reconstruct states as quick and painless as possible, right, as possible. So that's Lincoln's stance. However, members of his own party, the Radical Republicans, disagree with Lincoln. So they disagree with Lincoln. The Radical Republicans, rather than forgive, which Lincoln seems as he's willing to do, would rather punish. Punish the South. So they want something more strict. You know, look, this war cost the lives of 600,000, some 700,000 Americans died in the Civil War, deadliest war in American history. The Radical Republicans, who are mostly Northerners, right, the side that won, they want something more strict. They want the South to pay for what they had did. And so these Radical Republicans passed the Wade-Davis bill, which is kind of a competing plan with Lincoln's plan, and instead require the ironclad oath, which says, look, not 10%, but rather 50% of the population needs to pledge their allegiance. To the Radical Republicans, 10% is too little of the population. Instead, 50% need to proclaim their loyalty to the Union. But it's even a more strict oath. You know, it says that, you know, the oath being required would say that those individuals aren't just loyal to the U.S., but were never loyal to the Confederacy or the South to begin with. This reaches Lincoln's desk, right? So if you're not entirely familiar, just a quick civics lesson, right? We have our three branches of government. You have your legislative, your executive, and your judicial, right? Lincoln's right here in the executive. Congress, or the Radical Republicans, right, are in the legislative branch. So they passed the Wade-Davis bill, but before a bill can become a law, it has to go to the president. And the president has two choices. The president can either sign the bill, which makes it a law. He can veto it, which means it doesn't become a law. But there's actually one more option that the president can do, and that is do nothing. And we call this a pocket veto, because even though the president doesn't outright reject it, by not signing it, it simply just expires and it doesn't become a law. And what happened to the Wade-Davis bill was this choice right here. Lincoln simply refused to sign it. So there is some disagreement going on among the Republican Party, among Northerners, about how exactly to handle this particular situation. Now, one thing that Congress and the president both agreed upon was an amendment to the Constitution to abolish slavery throughout the United States. The previously mentioned Emancipation Proclamation was issued by the president in 1862. It only abolished slavery in rebellious states. So there's still a handful of states in the Union where slavery was technically legal. So the 13th Amendment would abolish slavery in the entire U.S., right? U.S. And an amendment to the Constitution is actually much stronger than more or less an executive order, which is what Lincoln set forward. It's even more strong than a law. It actually, actually gets written in the Constitution, which is like the concrete rule book for the United States government. Now, Lincoln actually never saw this go into action. He was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, right? Assassinated. I'll go ahead and mark this off here. President Lincoln. And he was a Confederate sympathizer. Abraham Lincoln was watching a play. Here's Lincoln right here. Here's John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth was part of a larger conspiracy to kill a number of members of Lincoln's cabinet. Booth was really the only one who succeeded. He walked up to the, balcony or whatever you call it, shot Lincoln in the back of the head. A manhunt ensued for the next couple of days or so. Eventually, John Wilkes Booth was killed in a shootout. But this was tremendously traumatizing for the nation because not only had this been the first president ever assassinated in American history, but it was also at a very crucial moment. So Lincoln really wouldn't be able to see what happened during Reconstruction. His plan, in fact, really didn't even go into action because he was assassinated so quickly after the end of the Civil War, only 5 days after the war ended. But when the 13th Amendment was eventually ratified, it did take some time for that news to travel. The holiday Juneteenth is a holiday or celebration of the news of emancipation reaching Texas, right? Reaching Texas. So Juneteenth is sometimes celebrated as the day of emancipation because even though earlier laws like the Emancipation Proclamation, like the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, that news didn't always travel so quickly. And so Juneteenth was the day that it had reached specifically Galveston, Texas. So with Lincoln out of the picture, the question now becomes, well, whose lap does Reconstruction fall to? And when the president is assassinated, the office of the presidency goes to the vice president, and that was Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson was the vice president. Now, president, right? And now in charge of Reconstruction. Right, now in charge of Reconstruction, the process by which former Confederate states will be brought back into the Union. A little bit about Andrew Johnson. He was from the South. This is very important, from the South. He had very humble origins growing up. He grew up very poor, unlike many of his contemporaries. This was a guy involved in Southern politics, and Southern politics were more or less dominated by the plantation-owning class. Johnson was not from that class. He was from very poor, humble origins, eventually becoming a senator from Tennessee who, despite the fact that Tennessee seceded, so Tennessee was a southern state that sided with the Confederacy, Johnson remained loyal to the Union. And in fact, that's why Lincoln chose him to be a vice president, because by choosing a loyal Southerner, that was showing a pathway towards reconciliation. That was a good sign for the country, so to speak. Johnson, like Lincoln, favored a quick reincorporation. So to go back to say essentially what Lincoln wanted for Reconstruction, this idea that you're going to reconstruct the states as quick and painless as possible. That is more or less the same sentiment that is held by Andrew Johnson as well. And this eventually puts him at odds with other Northerners, right? So he's put at odds with Northerners. right? He issues a proclamation of amnesty, which pardons all Confederates except, right, and this is the same thing essentially that Lincoln had, except high-ranking Confederate leaders, right? So if you were instrumental in the Confederate rebellion against the United States, so we'll say except Confederate leaders. But this is one way that Johnson is different than Lincoln, because he also excluded and the planter class, right? And that was one way of Johnson getting back at the planter class. Those are the plantation owners. Those are people who own slaves. Johnson also wanted to exclude them because he really felt that the rich Southerners were responsible for the Civil War. And, really, in Johnson's eyes anyways, it was the poor Southerners that more or less paid the price with their lives. However, what this allowed for was for former Confederate leaders to re-enter the U.S. government, including Congress. One of them being Alexander Stephens. He was the former vice president of the Confederacy. This right here was objected to, or objected by, I should say, Northerners, right? The idea that you can get a guy like Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, he was the second highest ranking political member, because additionally what other Southerners did who were excluded by this part of Andrew Johnson's plan was that they could petition Andrew Johnson for a pardon, and Andrew Johnson could or could not, if he wanted to, pardon them for their role in the Civil War. And if they were given a pardon, then that allowed them to re-enter the U.S. government. And so radical Republicans, now in charge of Congress in 1866, the Republicans, and again, just to kind of review here, politically speaking, the Republicans at this time are the party of the North. The Democrats at this time are the party of the South. So in the 1866 election, Republicans win big. And this puts really the country on a collision course between two different ideas about Reconstruction. President Johnson, on the one hand, who wants Reconstruction to be quick and painless, even though he was loyal to the Union during the Civil War, he is from the South. And we might say that, Johnson is a guy who his head logically is with the North, but his heart and his sympathies are with the Southern cause. And the radical Republicans, who are exclusively from the North, who see Reconstruction as, really making out to be a disaster, that having Alexander Stephens is completely unacceptable. And radical Republicans began to use a saying to describe what was going on. And that saying was, "We won the war, but lost the peace." Right? Northerners are saying, "We won the war, but we lost the peace."